This is not the beginning of the story. The beginning comes later, with a grey Tuesday, an iron bolt, and a rule about a corridor she was never supposed to enter. But this is the moment the story turns on. This is the 43rd night. She was not supposed to be in that room. The east corridor of Ashford Manor was sealed off with iron bolts and red wax, and every servant who worked in that house knew the rule better than they knew their own names. Do not enter the east corridor. Do not look at the mirror. Do not speak to whatever lived inside the glass. Aria Thornfield had followed that rule for 3 years. 3 years of scrubbing floors and carrying coal and pressing her back flat against the west wall whenever Lord Pemberton Vance swept past her in the hall, because a servant girl in Ashford Manor had exactly one job: to be invisible. She was very good at being invisible. She had made a particular study of it, the angle at which to hold your shoulders so you take up the least possible space, the rhythm of walking that is quick enough to be useful, but not so quick as to draw attention, the art of entering a room and completing your task, and leaving it so that the room itself barely notices you were there. She had been practicing since she was 12 years old, in the first house she had worked in, where a girl who was noticed was a girl who was in the way, and a girl in the way was a girl looking for a different position. She had held 4 positions before Ashford Manor, 4 households in 7 years, each one slightly colder than the last. Aria Thornfield had a great deal of practice at being grateful for the absence of the worst things, until the night she heard a voice so soft, so low, so full of quiet pain that she stopped walking mid-step and pressed her hand against the sealed door before she even realized what she was doing. The voice said her name. Not girl, not you there. Not the flat, dismissive tone she had heard 100 times from people who looked through her fun, like she was made of smoke. It said Aria, a single word, through iron and wax and glass, as though it had been waiting for her, as though it had always known exactly who would stop at that door. She had been following the rule for 3 years. 3 years of keeping her eyes down and her mouth closed and her hands busy, because a servant girl in Ashford Manor had exactly one job: to be invisible. She should have walked away. She should have pressed her knuckles to her mouth, swallowed the sound climbing up her throat, and returned to the west wing where she belonged. But the voice broke on the last syllable of her name, and something in that break, something raw and desperate and very, very tired, reached right through the door and the wax and the iron bolts and wrapped around her chest like a fist. She answered, and the moment she did, the sound of a chain snapping tore through the silence of Ashford Manor like thunder inside a jar. But to understand why she answered, you need to understand who she was before that night. You need to go back to the beginning. Aria Thornfield arrived at Ashford Manor on a grey Tuesday in early spring, with nothing but a cloth bag, a letter of recommendation, and the specific kind of hunger that comes not from missing one meal, but from missing many meals quietly, over a very long time. She was 19 years old. She had dark hair she kept pinned beneath her cap. She had quick hands and a quicker mind, and she had learned early that showing the second one got her into trouble, so she mostly showed only the first. The housekeeper who received her at the servants' entrance was a woman named Octavia Grayson, tall, straight-backed, with grey hair and grey eyes, and a mouth that looked as though smiling had been removed from it, surgically sometime around her 40th year. Octavia looked Aria up and down, the way a farmer looks at a horse, before deciding whether it's worth feeding. She said, "There are 3 rules in this house. First, you do not speak unless spoken to. Second, you do not enter any room that is locked. Third, you do not go near the east corridor under any circumstance whatsoever. If you break the first rule, I will dock your wages. If you break the second, you will be dismissed. If you break the third—" She paused. Something moved behind her grey eyes. "You will wish I had simply dismissed you." Aria said yes, ma'am, and meant it entirely. The house was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been beautiful for so long that the beauty has become part of the walls, ceilings painted with golden light, stairways wide enough for 3 people walking side by side, chandeliers that caught fire in the afternoon sun and scattered diamonds across the floors. But beneath all that beauty, Ashford Manor had a particular quality that Aria noticed on her first afternoon and could never quite name. It was something in the air, a stillness that was not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of held breath. The way a room feels when everyone in it is pretending very hard not to notice something. She was given a small room on the 3rd floor, with a narrow bed and one window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She was given a uniform, black dress, white apron, white cap. She was given her duties, floors in the west wing, silver in the dining room, linens twice a week. She was not given a reason for the East Corridor rule. She did not ask for one. She was not the sort of person who asked for reasons. Reasons, in her experience, were given to people who had some claim to understanding. Servants were given rules. She kept the rules. She kept them for a week, and then 2, and then a month. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Lord Pemberton Vance was a cold man who wore his coldness like armor and kept his household in a state of careful, permanent tension. She learned that his daughter, Callista Vance, was 17 and furious about it, and spent most of her time reading books she was not supposed to be reading and practicing a sharp wit on the servants, who could not answer back. She learned that there were no guests, no parties, no visitors that anyone acknowledged. She learned that the East Corridor was sealed not just with bolts and wax, but with something she could feel, a pressure that sat in her chest when she walked too close to that end of the house. Not painful exactly, but present, like a sound just below the range of hearing. Aria noticed everything. She filed everything away in the quiet part of her mind, where she kept the things she was not supposed to think about. And she got on with the work. It was on a night in late spring, the 43rd night she had spent in Ashford Manor, that she stayed later than she should have, in the east-facing hallway, polishing the banister on the main staircase, because Octavia had told her the wood was looking dull, and dull wood was unacceptable. The other servants had gone to bed. The house had gone quiet. The candles in the wall sconces had burned down to stubs that threw more shadow than light. She was working by feel more than sight. The cloth, moving in slow circles over the wood, her mind moving in the same absent way that hands move when they know what they are doing without needing instruction. She was not thinking about the East Corridor. She was thinking about whether she had enough saved to send something home to her mother, who was not well, and who wrote letters with hands that shook, and who always said she was fine, in a way that meant she was not fine at all. That was when the sound came. Not a shout, not a demand, just a voice. Low and male, and tired, in a way that went beyond the tiredness of one night and suggested something much longer, something like years. It said, "Is someone there?" Aria went very still. Her heart did something complicated inside her chest. Every trained instinct she had told her to pick up her cloth and her polish. The voice said, "I know someone is there. I can feel the warmth of you through the glass. Please." That last word, that one syllable, spoken not as a command or a request, but as something much more vulnerable than either. She walked to the East Corridor. She had told herself many times that she was a practical person, a sensible person, a person who understood that some rules existed for good reasons, even when those reasons were not shared with her. She stopped in front of the sealed door and pressed her palm flat against it, and the pressure she had always felt near this end of the house bloomed suddenly into something warm and golden, and entirely unlike anything she had experienced before. The voice came again, closer now, right on the other side of the door. Aria, her name, spoken like a door being opened after a very long time. She said, "How do you know my name?" A pause. Then, "I have watched this house for longer than you have been in it. You are the one who stops in the hallway, when the others rush past. You are the one who looked at the rose bush in the kitchen garden and touched one of the blossoms as though you were afraid it might disappear. I know your name because I have been paying attention to you since the day you arrived. She should have found that terrifying. She found it, instead, inexplicably comforting. The idea that someone in this enormous cold house had been paying attention. She said, "What are you?" The voice was quiet for a moment. When it returned, it carried something careful in it. Like a person choosing their words with the awareness that the wrong word might end the conversation. "I am a prince," it said. "I am a prisoner. I am something the lord of this house has decided the world would be better off without. My name is Lysander, and I have been inside this mirror for 11 years. 11 years. Aria's hand pressed harder against the door. She did not know what she felt in that moment. She could not have named it clearly, but something in her chest made a sound very much like a chain, snapping. 11 years, she said. "Alone? Until tonight," said Lysander. She stood there a long time after that, not speaking, just breathing. Then she said, "I am going to come back tomorrow night, and I am going to bring a candle so I can see what I am dealing with." There was a pause from behind the door, then a sound she had not expected at all. A short, rough sound that it took her a moment to identify. He was laughing, quiet and rusty, like a door that had not been opened in a long time, but still, undeniably, laughing. And Aria walked back down the hallway, and her hands were steady, and she was not afraid, and she could not entirely explain either of those things. She went back the next night. She told herself she went, because she was curious. Aria had always been cursed with curiosity. It was the thing that had gotten her in trouble in every position she had held before this one, the thing that made her look twice at locked doors and ask one more question than was wise. She told herself it was simply that. She did not examine the other part too closely, the part that had lain awake in her narrow bed and replayed the sound of his voice saying her name, until she had to press her face into the pillow to stop herself from smiling for no reason she could account for. She brought a candle, as she had promised. She also brought a small knife she kept in her apron pocket, not because she believed she would need it, but because she was a practical person, and practical people brought options. She slid back the iron bolt. It moved more easily than she had expected, as though the metal were reluctant to keep anything locked tonight, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was not what she had expected. It was not a dungeon. It was not a chamber of horrors. It was a sitting room, or it had been, once. High ceilings. Tall windows with the shutters bolted from inside, furniture draped in white sheets that had collected 11 years of dust, and on the far wall, taking up most of the space from floor to ceiling, a mirror. She had expected a mirror. She had not expected this mirror. It was framed in gold that had been shaped into thorns and flowering vines. The two wound around each other in a way that seemed to be still moving if she looked at it from the corner of her eye. The glass itself was not dark the way glass is dark in an unlit room. It had its own light, pale and shifting, like moonlight on still water, and on the other side of that light, barely visible through the pale, shifting glow, a shape, a silhouette. The suggestion of a man pressed close to the glass from within, tall, dark-haired, with hands flat against the surface, and eyes that caught the light of her candle, like two silver coins at the bottom of a well. She could not see him clearly. The glass muted everything, his form soft at the edges, his features more impression than detail. He was there, and real, and watching, but the mirror gave her only the outline of him, like looking at someone through deep water. She had not prepared herself, even for that. He was tall. She could sense that, even through the obscuring glow. He had dark hair. His hands on the glass were long-fingered, and his eyes, she could see those clearly, even through the haze of the mirror's enchantment. 2 points of pale silver light that caught her candle and held it. Beyond that, the mirror gave her nothing. It kept him half hidden, the way a dream keeps its details just out of reach. Around his wrists, around his ankles, around his neck. She could see the chains even through the glass. Not iron, something darker than iron, something that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. 7 chains in total, each one ending in the glass itself. Anchored there, as though the mirror were a wall, and the chains its fixtures. One of them, the one at his left wrist, was broken. The ends of it hung loose, still swaying slightly. Aria stared at the broken chain for a long moment. Then she said, "That happened when I answered you, didn't it?" Lysander did not look surprised that she had worked it out. "Yes," he said. "Every answer is power. Every genuine response given freely breaks one link of the binding. I have been speaking to the servants of this house for 11 years. Not one of them answered. Not one ever came back." He said it simply, without self-pity. But she heard what was beneath it. 11 years of speaking into silence. She crossed the room and sat down on the edge of one of the sheeted chairs, and held the candle up so she could see him better, and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, the way very few people had ever looked at Aria Thornfield, and then he sat down on his side of the glass, cross-legged, in the shifting pale light, and he told her. His name was Lysander Winterbourne. He was Fae, one of the older families, those who had ruled the boundary between the human world and the Fae realm, before the boundary was formalized into treaty, and the treaty was ratified, and the old ways began to change. His family had held Ashford Manor under an arrangement that stretched back centuries, a partnership between Fae and human, the Winterbournes providing the protective enchantment that kept the land fertile and the borders safe, the Vance family providing stewardship of the physical property. Lord Pemberton Vance had decided he wanted the enchantment without the partnership. He had spent 3 years finding a way to take it. He had found a scholar, a man of the kind that history always manages to produce when power is looking for a reason to do something it already intends to do, a sorcerer named Maelys Vaughan, who had studied the old binding contracts and found a clause, a technicality, a way to trap a fae in reflective glass and siphon the enchantment continuously, like tapping a tree for sap. Except the tree, in this case, was Lysander Winterbourne. And the sap was his power. And it had been flowing, drop by drop, into Lord Vance's estate, and his crops, and his protection wards for 11 years. "He takes it from you," Aria said. Every day, Lysander confirmed. "It does not kill me. Fae are difficult to kill, but it diminishes me, slowly, like a candle burning from both ends." He paused. "Or it did, until you answered. And now," he raised his left wrist, the one with the broken chain, and held it up to the glass. On her side, in the pale shifting light, she could see that the silver lines beneath his skin, those root-like, river-like veins, were slightly brighter than they had been when she first entered the room. "The siphon is weaker," he said. One answer, freely given, reclaimed something it could not touch. He looked at her, and something in his expression that had been very carefully controlled slipped slightly. "Aria, I have not felt this much myself in 4 years." She looked at him for a long time. He was watching her with that silver gaze, patient, not asking for anything, just watching, the way he had described watching her walk through the house, with the same quality of attention that she now understood was not strange but simply what Lysander was, a person who paid attention. She said, "I will come back every night, and I will answer every time you speak." Something moved across his face. She could not name it precisely, but it was something large, and something that he did not let stay long. He said, "You understand what that means for you. If Vance discovers you here—" "I understand," she said. "I have been invisible in this house for 3 years. I intend to keep being invisible for a little longer." He was quiet. Then, "Why? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Aria looked at the broken chain hanging from his wrist, and at the 6 chains still whole, and at the mirror's golden thorn frame. And she said, "Because someone left you here, and told everyone around you to pretend you do not exist. And I have some experience with being left somewhere and told to be invisible, and I find I am very tired of it." He did not answer that immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. "Thank you, Aria." She stood, straightened her apron, and took her candle. At the door, she looked back. He was still sitting where she had left him, cross-legged, watching her go. "Good night, Lysander," she said. "Good night," he said, for the first time in a very long time. She became a creature of 2 lives. In the daylight hours, she was what she had always been, Aria Thornfield, servant, invisible, capable, moving through the rooms of Ashford Manor, with her cloth and her polish and her downcast eyes. She said, "Yes, ma'am," to Octavia Grayson. She pressed herself flat against the wall when Lord Pemberton Vance swept past. She answered Callista Vance's barbed comments with the kind of blankness that was not stupidity, but the very deliberate choice to give someone nothing to work with. In the nighttime hours, she was something else. Every night she slipped the iron bolt, which she had begun to oil herself, carefully, so that it never made a sound, and crossed the sheeted room with her candle, and sat in the chair she had come to think of as hers, and talked to the man in the mirror. They talked about everything. She told him about her mother, and the shaking hands, and the letters that said fine in a way that meant not fine. He told her about the Fae court, and the way music worked differently there, not just heard but felt, as though the notes had weight and temperature, and could be wrapped around you like cloth. She told him about the particular misery of being clever in a position that punishes cleverness. He told her about the treaty negotiations that had been breaking down for a generation before his imprisonment, and the shape of the politics that had made Vance's trap possible. She told him about the rosebush in the kitchen garden, the one she had touched on, her first day, afraid it might disappear. "It was the first beautiful thing I had seen in months," she said, and I could not quite believe it was real. "I know the feeling." She looked at him through the glass. He was looking back at her. She looked away first. The 2nd chain broke on the 8th night, while she was telling him about the first time she had been dismissed from a position. She had been 16, and she had made the mistake of correcting the lady of the house on a matter of household accounts that Aria had worked out in her head, faster than the accountant had managed on paper, and the lady had found this deeply offensive, and said she sounded exactly like someone his sister had once tried to dismiss from the Fae court for knowing more than was comfortable. And then the 2nd chain had snapped, and the silver lines in his skin had brightened again, and he had stopped laughing and looked at his wrist with something like wonder, and the mirror cleared. Not all at once, in the way a window clears when breath has fogged it, and then the cold pulls the fog away. Gradually, from the center outward, the pale haze thinning, until she could see him properly for the very first time. He had sharp ears that came to points at the top, dark hair that fell loose around his face, silver veins running beneath the skin of his wrists, like roots or like rivers, or like veins full of something that was not blood. His eyes were a pale silver that caught her candle and threw it back at her doubled, and they were looking at her with an expression she had no name for, except that it was large, and it was real, and it had been waiting a long time to be seen. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He did not fill the silence. He let her look. "Two," he said. "It gets easier to breathe with each one." During her days, of looking more carefully at the parts of the house she was allowed to enter, not obviously, she was never obvious, but with the particular quality of attention she had learned from Lysander, which was different from the watchfulness she had always carried. His attention was active, searching. He had taught her, through conversation, to look at a room the way a person looks at a story, not just what is present, but what is missing, what has been moved, what someone is pretending not to notice. She was dusting Lord Vance's study, permitted, because he was away for the day, and the study needed to be kept clean, whether or not he was in it. When she found the ledger, it was not hidden. It was on the shelf with the other ledgers. But it was the only one with a lock, and the lock was not closed properly. And Aria Thornfield had always been very observant about things that were not quite right. She opened it. And beside each set of figures, a date and a notation, written in Lord Vance's cramped hand. She read 3 pages before she understood what she was looking at. The estate had been failing before Lysander's imprisonment. 11 years ago, Ashford Manor had been deep in debt. Creditors, failed harvests, 3 consecutive years of losses that would have eventually forced a sale. And then, over the course of 6 months following a date she recognized as the date the East Corridor had been sealed, everything had reversed. The crops had become extraordinary, the livestock healthy, the investments profitable. The estate had not just recovered, it had flourished. Lord Pemberton Vance had been draining a Fae Prince for 11 years, and this ledger recorded every drop. She closed the ledger carefully. She returned it to the shelf with the lock as she had found it. She finished dusting the room. She was almost at the door when Lord Pemberton Vance walked in. She pressed herself against the wall before she had consciously decided to move. The trained reflex of 3 years, the body knowing what to do before the mind caught up. Her cloth was in her hands. Her eyes were down. She was invisible. He did not look at her. He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, took something from it, and closed it again. He stood for a moment with his back to the room, to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man thinking about something he does not intend to share with anyone. He was not a large man. She had always thought of powerful people as large, but Pemberton Vance was thin and precise and cold in the way that cold things are cold, not by accident, but by design. The cold was something he had chosen and maintained, he said, without turning. The East Corridor bolt has been disturbed. Aria's pulse went very quiet. She said nothing. Oil on the mechanism, he said. Freshly applied. None of my people would go near that corridor. He turned then. He looked at her. Actually looked at her, which he almost never did, servants being beneath the level of his attention. His eyes were dark and entirely without warmth. Do you know anything about that? She met his gaze for exactly the length of time a servant could meet a lord's gaze without it becoming something. Then she looked down. No. My lord, she said. He watched her for 3 seconds that lasted considerably longer than 3 seconds. Then he said, The East Corridor is sealed for reasons that are not your concern. If I find that any member of my household has interfered with that seal, the consequences will be immediate and final. Is that understood? Yes, my lord, she said. He left. She stood against the wall for a long time after his footsteps faded. Her hands, when she finally looked at them, were perfectly steady. She had learned a long time ago how to be afraid very quietly. She thought, he knows. Not what she has done, not yet. But he is watching, and whatever she does next, she will need to do it fast. That night, she did not wait for Lysander to speak. She sat in her chair and said, I found your ledger. I know exactly what he has been taking from you and what he has built with it. I know the amounts. I know the dates. I know which investments were made with your power and which fields were fertilized with your enchantment and which protection wards were built on your strength. She paused. I am going to find a way to get that information out of this house, and I am going to find someone who can use it. Lysander stared at her. She had, over the weeks of their conversations, grown accustomed to the quality of his attention, but this was different. This was the look of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be surprised. He said, How long were you in that study? 20 minutes, said Aria, and in 20 minutes you read the ledger, understood its implications, and developed a strategy. I read quickly, she said, and the implications were fairly clear once you know what to look for. You told me what you had been used for. I simply looked for the record of it. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not the rusty warmth she had come to know, but something older and much more careful. "Aria," he said, "there is something else you need to know. About why Vance went to such lengths. About what my power actually protects. But I need you to understand what you are walking into." "Tell me," she said. He told her. The protection that the Winterbourne family had provided to Ashford and its surrounding lands was not just agricultural. It was a boundary ward, old Fae magic, the kind that had existed before the treaties formalized anything, the kind that held the thin places in the world together. The places where the boundary between realms was frayed. Without it, those thin places would slowly destabilize. Strange things would begin to happen near them. Not immediately. Fae magic faded slowly, but over time, the ward had already been degrading for 11 years. Not catastrophically, not yet. But the villages nearest the thin places had started reporting things. Livestock unease, crops that grew in wrong directions. Children who dreamed too vividly and woke saying they had heard music. "Maelys Vaughan knows this," Lysander said. "He is the one who found the claws that made the trap possible. He is not a stupid man. He knows that using my power this way degrades the ward over time. He knows what happens if the ward fails entirely." "Then why," said Aria, "would he help Vance do it?" Lysander's expression was something she had not seen from him before. Not anger. He was too controlled for anger. Something more complicated. "Because he believes," Lysander said slowly, "that the alternative is worse. He believes that if I am freed, I will take back what was stolen, and the boundary treaty will collapse, and the Fae will return to the old ways, and the old ways were not kind to humans." Aria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "And will you take back what was stolen?" "Yes," he said, "but not in the way he fears. I want the ward restored. I want the boundary protected. I want the treaty honored. What I do not want—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "What I do not want is to spend another 11 years in this glass, because a frightened man decided that one person's suffering was an acceptable price for everyone else's comfort." The third chain broke. Neither of them spoke about it, but Aria held his gaze through the glass, and she thought, "Maelys Vaughan believes he is saving the kingdom by keeping you in that mirror, and Lord Vance is letting him believe it, because it profits him, and the people in the villages near the thin places are slowly paying the price for both of them." She thought, "This is the shape of what I am dealing with," she thought. "I am going to need to be very careful." Callista Vance found her, not in the east corridor. Aria was too careful for that. She found her in the hallway outside, in the blue hour before sunrise. When Aria was returning from one of her nightly visits and had not yet settled her expression back into the careful blankness she wore during the day, she was almost to the servants' staircase when Callista stepped out of the shadows at the end of the corridor, wearing a dressing gown and holding a candle of her own, and looking at Aria with those sharp Vance eyes, dark, evaluating, and currently very interested. "You have been coming from the east wing," said Callista. It was not a question. Aria went very still. She considered her options in the space of a breath, and selected honesty partially, the kind of honesty that tells the truth while controlling what truth it tells. "Yes," she said. Callista's eyes narrowed. She was 17, and she had her father's cheekbones and her father's sharpness, and something else entirely, something that was not her father's at all. "I have known there was something in that room since I was 6 years old," said Callista. "I have known my father went in there. I have known Maelys Vaughan went in there. I have never known why, because the moment I began to ask questions about it, everyone in this house found reasons to not answer me." "Weeks, and I want to know what she found." Aria looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what Lysander had told her, that Maelys Vaughan's fear was not irrational, that there were genuine consequences to getting this wrong, that the wrong person with this information could make things much worse instead of better. She thought about the quality of Callista's watchfulness. about the books she read that she was not supposed to be reading, about the way she practiced her sharp wit, not on equals. She had no equals in this one, the house, but on people who could not answer back, which Aria had read not as cruelty, but as the particular loneliness of someone with a sharp mind. Nowhere to put it, she thought. Callista Vance is someone who wants what I have. Not the knowledge about the mirror, the freedom to seek it. She has grown up in this house, with everything, and the one thing she cannot get is the right to go looking for the things she wants to understand. She said, "If I tell you what I found, I need your word that you will not tell your father. Not because I do not trust you, but because your father is the problem." Something moved across her face that Aria had not expected. Not offense, but relief. The relief of someone who has suspected something for a very long time and has finally been told they were not imagining it. "You have my word," said Callista. They sat in the narrow window alcove at the end of the servants' corridor, Callista with her dressing gown, and Aria with her apron still on, and Aria told her everything. The mirror, Lysander, the chains, the ledger, Maelis Vaughan and his justification, the ward, the villages near the thin places. Callista listened without interrupting, which Aria had not expected. When it was over, Callista was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My father has been doing this for my entire life. He has been building this estate on a stolen foundation for my entire life, and the man responsible for keeping our land safe is chained to a wall in our east wing." Her voice was level. Her hands in her lap were not. "I have lived on top of this for 17 years, and no one told me." "No one tells servants either," said Aria. "We find out ourselves." Callista looked at her sharply. Aria said, "You have resources I do not have. You have access to your father's contacts, to his correspondence, to the outside world in ways I cannot reach from a servant's staircase. I have information, and I have access to the East Wing. Neither of us can do this alone." Callista looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I have always envied people who could simply go looking for things. No expectations, no inheritance, no one watching to see if you are suitable." She paused. "You probably think that is a very foolish thing to envy." "No," said Aria. "I understand it exactly. I have spent my life envying people who have the power to make things matter. Neither of us has everything. Between us, we might." Callista held out her hand. Aria took it. The alliance between the Lord's daughter and the servant girl was made in a window alcove before sunrise, with no witnesses and no ceremony. Which was, Aria thought, exactly the right way for something like this to begin. 2 days later, Callista came to find her in the West Wing corridor, with a letter in her hand and a careful look on her face. "I have written to a cousin," she said. "Her name is Brielle Ashford. She trained in treaty law under the Council in the East. She knows the boundary compact, the Fae agreements, all of it. More importantly, she has the standing to witness a Fae proceeding legally. Without a certified witness, anything we do in that room carries no formal weight." She paused. "I asked her to come. She said yes. She will be here within a fortnight." Aria looked at her. "You already knew we would need her," she said. "I knew," said Callista, "that if we were going to do this properly, we needed someone who could make it stick. My father has lawyers. We need law." "Yes," she said, "we do." She told Lysander about it the following night. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You trust her." "I trust that she wants the same thing I want," said Aria. "She wants the truth, and she wants to be the one who acts on it, not the one who is acted upon." "That," said Lysander, "is perhaps the most Fae thing I have heard a human say in 11 years. And there was that rough warmth in his voice again, "that you have always been more interesting than you were permitted to be." She looked at the mirror, at the glass between them, and felt, with sudden and very unwelcome clarity, the fact of it, the distance of it, the specific quality of his gaze through the glass, which was not the look of someone observing an ally or a helper or a cause. She was a practical person. She filed this feeling in the same part of her mind where she kept the things she was not supposed to think about. She noted it, and she filed it, and she said good night in a perfectly steady voice. But that night, in her narrow bed, she lay awake and listened to the house around her, and thought about the particular quality of being truly seen by someone, and how rare it was, and how much harder it made everything. The fourth chain broke 3 nights later, without either of them mentioning the reason it might have. It was Lysander who noticed the change in himself first. It happened on the night the fourth chain broke, the night after Aria had told him about Callista, about the alliance, about the plan beginning to take shape. He had been speaking normally, answering her questions, following the familiar rhythm of their evenings, and then he had said something. She could no longer remember what, some small thing that frustrated him, and the mirror had cracked. Not shattered, not broken. A single crack, spreading from his fingertips outward, like a spider's web of fractured light. They both went still. Then the crack sealed itself, the glass knitting closed as though it had never been, and Lysander pulled his hand back from the surface and looked at it the way someone looks at something that has betrayed them. "That is the flaw," he said. His voice was very controlled. Aria said, "What flaw?" He turned his palm over, looking at his fingers. The silver veins in his wrist were slightly brighter than they had been, but his expression was not the expression of someone experiencing something good. "When the chains break," he said carefully, "I recover power, but the power does not come back the same way it left. It comes back faster than my control can match. There are moments, now, when I feel anger or frustration or—" He paused. "Something else, strong. And the power responds before I can contain it. Each chain that breaks makes it worse. More power, less stability. That crack in the glass was not intentional." Aria said nothing. She was looking at him very carefully. "If I lose control entirely," Lysander said, "the mirror breaks from the inside," which sounds like freedom. But the enchantment that Vaughn built is not just a cage. It is also a container. If it breaks catastrophically rather than being properly dissolved, the power it has been siphoning releases all at once. It does not flow back to me cleanly. He stopped. "What does it do?" said Aria. "It destabilizes the nearest thin place," he said. "Completely. It does not weaken the boundary. It removes it. In one location. Permanently. And what comes through a permanently opened thin place is not—" He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "It is not something this village is equipped to manage." Aria sat with this for a moment. She thought about what he had told her earlier, that Malus Vaughn genuinely believed that keeping Lysander imprisoned was protecting people. She thought about the crack in the glass and what it meant. She thought about the fact that Vaughn was not entirely wrong, that there was a version of this that went very, very badly. She said, "So we cannot simply break all the chains at once, and we cannot break the mirror from the outside, because if the enchantment releases wrong, it destroys the boundary, and we cannot let Vaughn keep you here, because the ward is already failing and will eventually fail completely." "Correct," said Lysander. "What we need," said Aria, "is a way to dissolve the enchantment cleanly, which means we need the counterclause to the one Vaughn used to build the trap." Lysander looked at her. "Vaughn has the original contract. It is the document that governs the trap. Without it we cannot dissolve it cleanly," said Aria. "So we need the contract, which means we need to find it, which means—" She stopped, and she looked at him, and she felt the specific coldness of a plan that requires you to walk directly toward the most dangerous part of the problem, which means we need Malus Vaughn. Lysander's expression shifted, something in it that was not anger but was adjacent to it, the particular look of someone who has excellent reasons to feel one way about a person and is being asked to do something that requires them to set those reasons aside. "He put me here," Lysander said. His voice was quiet and flat. "He put you here because he was afraid," said Aria. "And he has spent 11 years watching the ward fail and the villages suffer, and I am willing to wager that he is significantly less certain of his righteousness than he was when he began. She waited. He was looking at the glass, at the place where the crack had been, at his own fingers. Then he said, "You are going to go to Vaughan directly, aren't you? You are not going to wait for a clever plan or a safer moment." "I am going to have Callista invite him to the house for a consultation," said Aria, "because she is the Lord's daughter, and she has that authority when her father is away. And I am going to be in the room. And I am going to make the argument that you just made to me, for me, that there is a version of this where everyone gets what they actually need, and it does not require one person to suffer indefinitely for it." She paused, and then I am going to hope he is tired enough of being wrong to listen. "You believe that will work. I believe it is worth trying before we try anything that might permanently open a hole in the boundary between worlds," said Aria. Something flickered in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of a smile on a person who was trying very hard not to show it. "Aria," he said quietly, "when the chains are gone and the ward is restored and the mirror is just a mirror, what do you want? For yourself, not for your mother or the village or the boundary or me. What does Aria Thornfield want?" She had not been asked that question in a very long time. She was not entirely sure anyone had ever asked it with the kind of genuine curiosity he was directing at her now. She said, "I do not know yet. I have been so long in the habit of wanting the safe thing that I am not sure I trust my wants. I think I need to—" She stopped. Then, more honestly, "I think I need to find out what it feels like to make choices that are mine, and then I will know what I want." He nodded, as though that was the only answer that made any sense. Then he said, very quietly, "Whatever you decide, I hope it includes some version of this, whatever this is, between us." She looked at the glass. She thought, "There is a mirror between us. There are 3 chains remaining on his side of it, and a frightened sorcerer, and a corrupt lord, and a failing boundary, and a plan that might not work," she thought. "And none of that changes what I feel." She said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow I talk to Callista." He smiled then, properly, fully, a smile that changed his face entirely, and made the silver in his eyes brighter than her candle. "Good night, Aria," he said. "Good night," she said, and meant about 7 different things by it. He was a small man, which Aria had not expected. She had built him in her imagination as something more imposing, because people who make decisions that trap other people for 11 years ought by rights to look like they are aware of the weight of what they carry. Maelis Vaughan did not look like a man carrying weight. He looked like a man who had decided, a long time ago, that his decision was correct, and had been living inside that decision ever since, comfortable, because certainty is always more comfortable than doubt. He had silver-streaked hair and small, precise hands and eyes that catalogued the room the moment he entered it, with the efficiency of a man accustomed to looking for threats. Callista received him in the small parlour, with the particular authority of a lord's daughter in the lord's absence, straight-backed, measured, courteous, in the exact way that communicates, "I am in charge of this room," without saying so directly. Aria stood against the wall in her servant's position, cloth in hand, invisible. Maelis glanced at her once and dismissed her immediately. "That was always the mistake," Callista said. "I asked you here because I wanted your professional assessment of the estate's enchantments. My father has spoken of instabilities in the outer wards. I wish to hear from the source." Maelis relaxed slightly, which was exactly what Callista had intended. He launched into a technical explanation of ward maintenance that was clearly designed for a young woman who did not know much about Fae magic, could be managed. Aria listened and noted every detail. Then Callista said, at exactly the right moment, "And the mirror in the east wing, is that also something that requires maintenance?" He went very still. His eyes moved to Aria, then back to Callista. Something shifted in his face, Not guilt exactly, but the look of a man recalculating. Aria set down her cloth. She said, "The fifth chain broke last night. He can now see and hear beyond the glass. The siphon is losing cohesion, and there is a crack in the mirror that appears when his power surges. We believe we have perhaps 2 months before the enchantment fails on its own terms, and when it does, the collapse will open the nearest thin place permanently. You are the one who has been answering it. Not a question, a conclusion drawn from data. His name is Lysander Winterbourne," said Aria, "and he wants what you want, a stable boundary, a protected ward, the thin places held closed. He wants the same things you spent 11 years convincing yourself could only be achieved by keeping him in that mirror." Melis's jaw tightened. She continued, "The ledger in Lord Vance's study shows what this estate has gained from the siphon. It also shows the dates of every anomaly in the outer wards, correlating exactly with the degradation of the binding. The ward is not holding because of the siphon. The ward is failing because of it. You have been paying for temporary security with permanent damage, and I think some part of you has known this for years." The room was very quiet. Callista did not move. Aria did not look away from Vaughan. Melis sat down. He did not do it with dignity. He did it the way people sit when their legs stop cooperating. He said, "If I release the binding correctly, he will be free, and he will have power again. And the Fae are bound by the treaty," Aria said, "and he has told me, through glass, every night for weeks, what he intends to do with his freedom. He intends to restore the ward. He intends to honor the treaty. He intends to bring the matter of what Lord Vance did before the Fae Court and the Treaty Council, and have it addressed properly, without violence and without collapse." She paused. "He is not what you are afraid of. He is what you were afraid of losing." Melis looked at his hands. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The certainty that had lived in it was still there, but it was older. The certainty of a man who has been certain for a long time and is not sure, today, what he is certain of. "I told myself," he said slowly, "that one person's suffering was a smaller harm than thousands. I told myself that the boundary was more important than any single life. I told myself that Lysander Winterbourne was—" He stopped. "Not a person?" said Callista. Her voice was not cruel. It was precise. He flinched. Aria said, "The contract that governs the binding. Do you have it with you?" He looked up at her sharply, then down at the leather satchel beside his chair that he had not let go of since he entered the room. He said, "The counterclause requires his consent and mine simultaneously. It has to be spoken at the mirror, with both parties present to the glass." He paused. "And it requires that the binding energy be redirected, not released. I need to root it back into the ward structure directly, rather than letting it dissipate, or the thin place." "I know," said Aria. "We know. That is why we are doing this with the contract rather than without it. That is why I am talking to you, instead of simply breaking the remaining contract." Chains. Something moved in Melis Vaughan's face. She thought, he is recognizing himself. He is seeing that this is what he should have done 11 years ago. Talked, planned, found the version of this that did not require a prison. She thought, that recognition is going to hurt him for the rest of his life, and she was sorry for it. And she was not going to stop what she was doing. He said, "I will come to the mirror tonight. I will speak the counterclause, and I will redirect the binding energy into the ward." He stopped. "And then I will face whatever comes after that." "Yes," said Aria. "You will." She met Callista's eyes across the room. Callista gave her nothing. Not a smile, not a nod. Just a look that said, "We did that." Yes, Aria thought. We did. She went to the East Wing that afternoon, before anyone else arrived, and she told Lysander. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Aria, what you just did was not complicated," she said. "He was tired of being wrong. I just gave him a reason to say so. It was." without knowing for certain that it would work. She said, "I was fairly certain." He said, "You were not." She looked at the glass, at him, at the two remaining chains. The silence between them was not empty. It was the full kind, the kind that is heavier than words and means more. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. She stood and pressed hers against it from the other side, not touching, the glass cold between them, but close as they had ever been. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. They gathered at the mirror just before midnight, 4 people on one side of the glass, 1 on the other. Aria had told Lord Vance's household steward that Callista had authorized a late-night consultation regarding the estate wards, which was true enough, in its way. The steward had not questioned it. Callista was still the Lord's daughter, and the Lord was not yet back from his travels, and some things were easier when certain people were absent. The sheeted room looked different, with all of them in it. 4 candles instead of 1. Malus Vaughan standing near the door with his satchel and his contract, and the look of a man attending his own reckoning. Callista beside him, still straight-backed, still precise. The one who had arrived a fortnight ago with treaty law in her head, and the calm bearing of someone who had witnessed difficult proceedings before and would witness them again, standing at the side of the room with her record book already open. And Aria. She stood directly in front of the mirror. Lysander was on the other side, standing now, not sitting. He had not sat since she had told him about tonight. He was wearing something different from the dark clothing she had seen him in before. She did not know if he had changed it, or if it had changed with him as the chains broke, but it was deep blue, and it made the silver of his eyes very bright. He looked at her when she came in, not at Vaughan, not at the room, at her. She thought, "I am not going to think about what I feel right now. I am going to get this done." The Fae script, still faintly luminous. He spread it on the sheeted chair she always used, and read the counter-clause silently, lips moving, checking and rechecking. Then he looked up at Lysander through the glass. They looked at each other for a moment. The sorcerer and the prince, 11 years of damage between them, the weight of it filling the room. Malus said, "Lysander Winterbourne, I ask your consent to speak the counter-clause and dissolve the binding. I will redirect the stored energy into the ward structure. I will not allow it to dissipate. You have my word, for what it is worth." Lysander looked at him for a long moment. Aria held her breath. Lysander said, "I accept. You have my consent." Malus nodded once. Then he began to read. The Fae script in the contract began to glow as he read. Not a gentle glow, but a live one, burning hotter with each line, the light spreading from the page to the mirror's golden frame, igniting the thorns and the flowering vines, making them flicker and dance, as though the gold itself were remembering what it had been before it was a prison. The chains responded. They did not break this time. They dissolved. From the anchors outward, from the glass toward Lysander's wrists and ankles and neck, the dark metal lightening as it went, changing from that light drinking black, to grey, to silver, to nothing. The 5 that had already broken were long gone, wisps of old binding, the residue of 11 years. But the 6th dissolved as the reading reached its midpoint, a long, slow release, like a breath held since before Aria was born. The light in the room was extraordinary. The candles seemed small and far away. The mirror was blazing. All that pale, shifting light she had seen in it every night, amplified 100 times, flooding the sheeted furniture and the dusty ceiling and the bolted windows. Brielle Ashford was speaking. The treaty witness formula, clear and steady, anchoring the proceeding in law, making it official, making it real. Malus Vaughan reached the final line of the counter-clause. He stopped reading. He looked at the page. He folded the contract carefully and put it back in his satchel, and did not speak again. And then the 7th chain dissolved. The silence afterward was absolute. The mirror's light contracted, all that blazing brightness pulling inward, rushing toward the center of the glass, and for one terrible moment, Aria thought it was going wrong, thought the power was not going where it needed to go, thought the thin place was, and then it released outward in a wave she could not see but could feel, deep in her chest, in the soles of her feet, in the roots of her hair, a wave of something that was not heat, and was not sound, but was unmistakably real, moving through the house and into the ground, and outward, in all directions like a heartbeat. The ward, the boundary enchantment, rushing back into the places it had been draining from for 11 years, not as a trickle but as a flood, and the mirror stopped glowing, and the golden frame settled, and the glass was just glass, and on the other side of it, Lysander Winterbourne pressed his palm flat against the surface, no chains on his wrist, no dark metal, just his hand, and looked at Aria. She pressed her palm against it from her side. Cold glass. His eyes were very bright. He said, "The glass is still between us." "Yes," she said. "The enchantment is dissolved," he said, and she heard the question inside the statement. She looked at the frame, at the thorns and the vines, still now, not moving, at the glass that was just glass. She looked at Brielle Ashford, who was watching them both with the careful expression of someone who has witnessed a great many Fae proceedings and knows exactly what a dissolved binding should do and is waiting for it to do it. Brielle said, very quietly, "The mirror is only glass now. It has no Fae enchantment remaining. The boundary between the glass and this room is physical only." Physical only. Aria looked at her palm against the glass. At his palm on the other side of it, she took a breath. She pushed the mirror. It swung open on hinges hidden in the frame. A door, always a door, just a door sealed with magic for 11 years, and the room on the other side of it was dark and smelled of old stone and the specific cold of a place that has been sealed a very long time, and Lysander Winterbourne stepped through the frame and into the room on her side, and stood in front of her. She had seen him through glass every night for weeks. She thought she had understood what he looked like. She had not. He was taller than she had gauged. The silver in his eyes was brighter, the points of his ears, the long fingers, the silver veins visible in his wrists, not hidden, not diminished, running strong and bright under his skin, no longer feeding anything but himself. He looked at her. He said, "Hello, Aria." She said, "Hello, Lysander." His expression shifted. She had come to know every version of it. The careful version, the warm version, the rusty laugh version, the specific version he only wore when something had moved him and he was trying to decide how much to show it. This was that last one. He reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm. She had not been prepared for that. 11 years in a mirror, and his hand was warm against hers, and solid, and real. She said, in a voice that was entirely steady, only because she was concentrating very hard on making it so, "You are considerably taller than I expected." He made the sound she loved, that rough, rusty, real laugh, and his fingers curled around hers. Behind them, Maelys Vaughan was very quiet. Callista was watching them with an expression that was more complicated than it appeared. Something in it that Aria recognized as the cost of wanting what another person has, and choosing to be glad for them anyway. Which is more than she has ever been allowed to use. She will be more than all right. Brielle Ashford was writing in her record book, and Aria Thornfield, servant, invisible, practical, the girl no one counted, stood in the blazing aftermath of something that had taken 11 years to undo and was not ready to be undone in a single night, and held the hand of a Fae Prince who had learned her name from a rosebush and a window, and thought, "I do not know what I want yet. I said that. But this is part of it," Lysander said quietly, so only she could hear. "I spent 11 years in that glass. I used to make lists, things I would do when I was free, places I would go, people I would see." He paused. In the last weeks, the list has had only one thing on it. She looked up at him. To stand on the same side of the glass as you, he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Well, that one is done." He smiled. She said, "What comes next on the list?" His thumb traced a slow arc across her knuckles. "I thought I might ask you to help me make a new one." She thought about what she had said to him, that she needed to find out what it felt like to make choices that were hers. She thought about the East Corridor, and the iron bolt and the candle, and the 43 nights of her old life, followed by all the nights of this one. Every moment of reaching through a problem toward the person on the other side of it. She had been finding out what she wanted the whole time. She had just not let herself look directly at it. She said, "I would like that." Outside Ashford Manor, the ward pulsed strong and steady through the boundary of the world, holding the thin places closed, keeping what should be kept, and protecting what had been unprotected for too long. The ledger in Lord Vance's study waited for the council that would come. Malus Vaughan sat in the sheeted room a long time after everyone else had gone, and he was quiet with himself, which is the hardest kind of quiet. And Aria Thornfield walked through the house. She had kept invisible for 3 years with her hand in Lysander Winterbourne's, and she was not invisible anymore, and she was not afraid of it, and the morning was just beginning to grey the windows when they reached the kitchen garden. She stopped in front of the rosebush. It had bloomed overnight. Full summer roses, deep red, the dew still on them, exactly as real as everything else. Lysander stood beside her and looked at it. He said, "You told me about this, the day you arrived. It was the first beautiful thing," she said, "that I thought might not stay." He looked at her. "Some things," he said, "are built to last considerably longer than anyone fears." She touched one of the blossoms. It did not disappear. Behind them, the manor settled into the morning, and somewhere in the walls, the ward hummed steady and full and alive, and the world held together at its seams, and the girl who had been ordered never to answer stood in the garden with the prince she had freed, and thought, "I answered, and it was enough." It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 things happened in the weeks following the night the 7th chain broke. The first was that Lord Pemberton Vance returned from his travels to find a Treaty Council representative and 2 Fae Court observers waiting in his hall, seated at his own dining table, drinking his good tea, accompanied by his daughter, who informed him with complete composure that she had taken the liberty of inviting them. He stood in the doorway of his own dining room for a long moment. Aria watched him from the far end of the hall, not pressed against the wall this time, not invisible, simply standing, and she saw on his face something she had never seen there before. Not anger, not cold calculation, something smaller and more honest than either of those things. He recognized the ledger on the table in front of the council representative. She watched him recognize it. She watched him understand, in the space of a single breath, that the silence he had purchased for 11 years had run out. He looked at Callista. Callista looked back at him with an expression that Aria could not entirely read. Not triumphant, not cold. Something more complicated. The look of a person who has loved someone, and found, on a particular morning, that the love is still there, but the respect has left the building entirely. Vance was a man who had built a great deal of his life on other people's inability to act without permission. He had constructed a household where no one moved without his say, where every decision deferred to him, where silence was so deeply trained into the people around him that he had long since mistaken it for consent. He had not accounted for Callista. He had not accounted for Aria. He had not, for 11 years, accounted for Lysander. The proceedings were not swift. They were not comfortable, but they were thorough, and they were witnessed, and Brielle Ashford's record book was present at every session, and when it was over, Ashford Manor's estate remained intact, but its enchantments belonged again to the Winterbourne Compact, and Lord Pemberton Vance had agreed, in writing, to terms that Callista had personally reviewed before allowing him to sign them. Callista Vance was 18 by then. She would spend the next 2 years studying treaty law under Brielle Ashford's instruction. She would spend the 2 years after that doing something with it. She had not yet decided, but she was a person now who was permitted to look for things, and she intended to look thoroughly. The second thing that happened was Malus Vaughan. He did not disappear. That would have been easier, in some ways. For him, certainly. He stayed. He continued his work on the boundary wards, but now in collaboration with Lysander, rather than against him. A working relationship that was, in its early days, conducted in a silence so thick you could press your thumb into it. They were not friends. Aria did not expect them to become friends, but they were two people who wanted the same thing and who were slowly, carefully, beginning to believe that they might achieve it together better than alone. Was a man living in the long aftermath of having been wrong. He carried it differently than she had expected, not with collapse, but with a particular kind of daily reckoning, the sort that rebuilds things instead of tearing them down. She respected that. She did not entirely like him, but she respected him. The third thing that happened was smaller and larger than either of the first two. It happened on a morning in late summer, when the kitchen garden was full of sound. Bees, birds, the particular rustling of things that are alive and comfortable being alive. And Aria was sitting on the low stone wall, with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold because she had been distracted. She was distracted because Lysander was sitting beside her. He had been outside every morning since the night the mirror opened. She understood, without him saying so directly, that being outside was something he was still learning, that 11 years of glass and enclosure had made the sky feel enormous and slightly bewildering, and that he was relearning it the same way you relearn anything you have been away from too long. Slowly, with great attention to detail. He paid attention to everything, the way he always had, the way he had paid attention to her, through glass, before she ever knew he existed. He was looking at the rosebush. She said, "You have been looking at that rosebush for 20 minutes. I am remembering what you told me about it," he said. "The first beautiful thing you thought might not stay." She looked at it too. The summer bloom had passed, but the hips were forming now, small, bright, the promise of something that would outlast the season. "It stayed," she said. "Yes," he said. He turned and looked at her with that full attention that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and was still, after everything, the thing she found most extraordinary. Not the Fae power, or the silver eyes, or the fact of him, but the quality of his gaze, the sense in it, of being seen all the way down. He said, "The court has asked me to return, to report formally on the ward restoration and the treaty renegotiation. It is several days' journey from here." He paused. "I would like you to come with me, if you are willing, but I want to be clear that this is not—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I am trying," he said, "to not say things in the way that assume you will go wherever the situation points you. I am trying to ask, genuinely ask, as a question you can say no to." She looked at him. She thought about the narrow bed and the coal and the polish and the years of keeping her eyes down. She thought about the first night she had walked to the sealed door and pressed her palm against it, which had felt at the time like a mistake and had turned out to be the most accurately chosen moment of her life. She thought about choices that are yours, about the difference between being pointed somewhere and deciding to go. She thought, the Fae Court, a place she had never been and could not have imagined reaching. Music that has weight and temperature. A world entirely beyond anything her mother's letters or Octavia Grayson's rules or Lord Vance's cold hallways had ever prepared her for. She thought, I would be afraid. I would be completely out of my depth. I would spend the first week not knowing what anything was and having to ask about all of it, she thought. Good. That sounds like exactly the right sort of place to find out what you want, she said. Yes, I am willing. Something in him settled. Not tension releasing exactly, but a held thing becoming unheld. He looked at her with that barely contained expression she had come to know, the one he only wore when something moved him more than he intended to show. "I should warn you," he said, "that the court is complicated," she said, "probably political. Full of people who will underestimate me because of where I come from." She tilted her head. "I have some experience with that." He did laugh then, full and warm, and no longer rusty at all. The laugh of a person who has had sufficient practice at it to have worked the rust away. She smiled. It was, she thought, a very good sound to have been part of reclaiming. They sat in the kitchen garden as the morning warmed, and the rosebush rustled in the light wind, and somewhere in the boundary between this world and the one adjacent to it, the ward held steady and strong. A thing rebuilt, a thing restored, doing its quiet and necessary work of keeping what should be kept. In the east wing, the mirror was just a mirror now. No light behind it, no voice within, just old gold and still glass, and the memory of what it had held, and what it had taken, and what it had, finally, given back. Aria Thornfield had come to Ashford Manor with a cloth bag, a letter of recommendation, and the specific kind of hunger that comes from missing many things quietly over a very long time. She was leaving it with considerably more than she had arrived with. Not things, not position, not even certainty about what came next. She was leaving with the knowledge that she had looked at a sealed door and a forbidden voice, and chosen, deliberately, to answer, and that the answer had mattered, and that the answer had cost something, and given back more, and that this was what it felt like to make a choice that belonged entirely to her. She would make more of those choices. She intended to. The road to the Fae court was long, and she had a great many questions to ask, and someone beside her who had 11 years of things to say, and a great deal more patience for saying them now that there was no glass between them. She picked up her cold tea. She drank it anyway. Some things are worth finishing, even when the moment has passed, and some stories, the real ones, the ones that cost something to tell and something to hear, do not end when the last chain breaks. They begin there, right there, in the quiet morning, in the garden, with the tea gone cold and the roses already past their bloom, and everything ahead still unwritten. That is where Aria Thornfield's story truly started, in the answered question, in the opened door, in the choice to reach toward something through the glass, instead of walking away from it. That is where all the best stories start. Thank you for watching. Chain breaking, then leave a like and share it with someone who loves a story that earns its ending. Subscribe for more stories told like they deserve to be told, and I will see you in the next one.